Starting at the top here, how did you become a leading fact checker of sorts in this international conversation about nutrition policy and all things public health?
Well, how far back would you like me to go? I I suppose I guess I could say that my exact area of expertise, I think, just met a moment, and that's really kind of what fueled this. I had joined social media in 2022 when I was pregnant with my daughter, and I joined really because algorithms are as algorithms you get into a certain algorithm, and I actually wasn't in an algorithm that was seeing a lot of misinformation until I was pregnant with my daughter. And then, social media just kind of knows you're pregnant, and they start feeding you lots of stuff about pregnancy because it's a very vulnerable kind of time in life. And I just started seeing a lot of nutrition misinformation in particular, targeting that demographic of people. And so I decided to just kind of join and start combating some of that and being like, no, this isn't accurate. Actually, like maybe look into this, things like that. So that's what got me started on social media. And I was really focused on that particular demographic until 2 summers ago when I started seeing more and more people getting interested in public health and public health nutrition and a lot of just more nutrition information, just mainstream. And that's when I kind of shifted my focus to be much more in line with what my area of study is, which was chronic disease prevention.
And where was it, I guess, from an academic point of view that you developed your understanding of this space?
Yeah, so my research focus when I was in graduate school was really cardiometabolic disease. So looking at what are ways that we can reduce risk of cardiometabolic disease. I was really privileged to be in a community or a group or a program, I should say, that was really, everybody was kind of focused on that, but from different areas. So we had, exercise physiologists, we had nutrition, we had sleep researchers and stress researchers, all these different aspects of health that really went into reducing risk of chronic disease. And I really focused kind of on the interdisciplinary side of exercise and nutrition science, looking at specifically cardiometabolic disease. So things like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, things that we know of as lifestyle-related chronic disease. So what are things that you could be doing to reduce your risk? Because even back then, we already knew that chronic disease was a problem in this country. And so figuring out how we can try to reduce risk. And as I kind of went through my program, I started off very individually focused. Like, what is somebody at an individual level able to do to reduce their risk? And I found that we actually have really good data of things that people can be doing to reduce risk of cardiometabolic disease. Where the big issue lies is in behavior change. And I'm certainly not a behavior change researcher. I would never claim to be that, but that's really where the biggest issue is. And so when you start getting into that research, you start looking at, okay, well, why are people not adopting these behaviors? And it becomes pretty impossible to not start looking at a systemic view of kind of why, the vast majority of Americans are not adopting evidence-based health recommendations. And so that's what really kind of fueled my interest in that particular area.
Yeah, and at least from my perspective, if I look at the traction that you've got over the last few years on social media, which has been nothing short of incredibly rapid. People were clearly thirsty for the information that you're putting out, and I think you do a great job of looking past the overly simplistic explanation and explaining these underlying systems that are at play. Can you explain the difference between studying how food and nutrients affect health and studying the underlying systems that we can't see when we go out and buy food, but very much shape our decisions?
Sure. Yeah. So it's the difference between personal health and systemic or public health. And so, we all at an individual level make individual choices within systems. And so those systems can either be set up for the most people to succeed or for the most people to fail, or some variation in between. And in our country, we very much set up our systems for the most people to fail. And we see that in outcome data in terms of, the number of people that are meeting nutrition recommendations. I mean, over 90% of us aren't meeting vegetable intake recommendations or fiber intake recommendations. 80% of us aren't meeting physical activity recommendations. And I could go on and on with these behaviors that we're just not meeting. And so at an individual level, if I'm working with you one-on-one, right, or you're working with me one-on-one, we're going to go over things that you can do on an individual level. What can you do from a diet perspective? What can you do from an exercise perspective, from a stress and a sleep, perspective? So we'll talk about all of those things. A public health perspective looks at, okay, how can we design systems so that the most people can meet these evidence-based recommendations. So if the evidence-based recommendation is meeting vegetable guidelines and 90% of Americans aren't meeting vegetable intake guidelines, why is that? And then you look at our food environment and you say, okay, well, our food environment is about 70% prepackaged ultra-processed foods, many of those low-nutrient ultra-processed foods. We have a system where we really, from a subsidy perspective, we incentivize the production of these low-cost kind of nutrient-devoid ultra-processed foods. And we have areas of the country that don't have ready accessibility to a lot of these fruits and vegetables and produce that we would like people to see. So, our recommendation would be make half your plate fruits and vegetables, but we're not designing a food system that prioritizes everybody making half their plate fruits and vegetables. So that's kind of the difference in terms of if we're working with you one-on-one, if we're thinking of an individual perspective, we're going to recommend eating more fruits and vegetables, right? Eating a variety of protein. And from a systems perspective, how can we design our food system so that more people can be adopting those behaviors?
Do you have a sense from the literature of what percentage of the chronic disease burden in a country like America would be attributable to the systems versus attributable to education at the individual level?
Yeah, I think that would be really hard to parse out and figure out. And I don't know in terms of exact percentages, but I'll say that when we are looking at it and we're comparing countries and we're looking at not even just countries, but even areas of the country where we see really strong public health systems, more people adopt healthful behaviors. We see that globally, and we see that in our country as well in terms of some states, because some of these public health programs are run at the state level. And so you'll see states that have stronger public health infrastructure that see better health outcome data.
Why are you so passionate about this, helping people better understand these systems?
I think because there's a bit of a disconnect. I have heard a lot of times over my career, like food shouldn't be political and nutrition shouldn't be political. And I understand the desire, because I think how we think about politics is quite divisive and quite negative. And I think that that's kind of how it's portrayed. And I don't necessarily view politics like that. I think of politics as the policies that are impacting all of these things that impact our daily life. And so I think helping people to understand that a bit better. And, every part of food, from the food we grow to the food that's on our shelves, to the food that gets marketed and sold, to the food that's available to different people in the country, is political. And when I say that, I just mean that policy dictates a lot of that. And so helping people to bridge that gap of understanding, I think, can be really important to then kind of like focus our efforts. So if all of us, because, a lot of us in a very bipartisan way want a lot of the same things. And so if we can understand kind of why our food environment is the way that it is, why people aren't meeting these health outcomes, then we can focus our energy into kind of changing some of the policy that would be needed to design systems that help more people to succeed.
Yeah, I think this is a very important distinction for people to sit with, that there's what we eat, and then there are these systems and these policies that very much dictate, why we eat that way.
Yeah. And, I love talking about the public health side of things and the systemic side of things, but I also love talking about the individual health side of things, right? And like, how can we maximize our health? How can we optimize our health from an individual perspective? And I think both are really important and necessary, but they're not the same.
There needs to be some balance in that conversation so people still feel empowered and have some agency over the choices they're making.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a wave of kind of populist nutrition messaging right now in the United States, and you seem to cover it all. And it spreads globally through social media. Some of it kind of sounds promising. Some of it is potentially dangerous. And I want to understand what's really going on beneath the surface while I have this time with you today. At the center of a lot of that conversation is a movement called MAHA, Make America Healthy Again, which is led by RFK Jr. and Casey Means, Kelly Means, names people may have heard of before. For listeners who may not be familiar, what exactly is MAHA?
I think MAHA it's a movement it's kind of like a grassroots movement of people who were looking around and concerned about health outcomes that they saw in the country. our food environment without maybe even knowing that this is what they were concerned about, but systems in the country that are set up for a lot of people to fail. They were seeing chronic disease rates increase in the population as a whole, but also in our children. And they knew something was wrong and they knew something was off. And I think MAHA was a movement that kind of came in and gave an answer to those problems and helped to galvanize a lot of people who maybe never even thought about public health systems before, who started recognizing, hey, we need to have some say here. We need to improve things. And so, the MAHA movement itself, I think, is very much from the ground up, is a movement of people who are genuinely concerned about the health of Americans and our food system and those types of things. I think from the top, it's certainly a political movement, and it was a political movement for one political party that kind of spoke to a lot of the things that people care about in order to, get votes for that political party.
Yeah, I've seen you say before that the reason that MAHA is so dangerous is that they talk about those things that we all want, what you've just pointed out. But while they say that, their actions are more of a distraction. Can you unpack what that looks like and what that is?
Yeah. So, a couple of things. Let's just talk about some of the things that MAHA talks about quite a bit. So they talk about additives in our food supply, for example. So they'll look and they'll say, okay, our food supply is, let's say, at the high end, 70% ultra-processed food. All of these additives and ultra-processed foods are the problem. If we all agree that that's true, and the evidence doesn't necessarily agree that that's true, but if we all agree that that's true, what would be the solution? And so the solution, if you're trying to design a system that is going to have more oversight over additives in our food supply, would be to strengthen the scientists who are actually overseeing the additives in our food supply. If you want to do something like close the GRAS loophole, which would help to strengthen oversight of the additives in our food supply, you need a strong FDA and you need a strong food side of the FDA. And so this is where it's really important to understand, kind of like if you're diagnosing a problem, you have to understand what the solution needs to look like. And so that would be the solution. But what we're seeing is defunding of the FDA, and we're seeing scientists being cut at the FDA, and we're seeing a weaker food side of the FDA. And so that is an exact kind of contrast to what the MAHA movement would like to see. And I can kind of run down lots of these. Like they want to see less environmental toxins, less heavy metals in our food, soil, and water, right? But what we're seeing right now from this administration, which is the administration MAHA aligned itself with, we're seeing deregulation of lots of these companies that are polluting industries. We're seeing a rollback of a lot of environmental regulations, and particularly with like oil companies and things like that are going to increase the amount of heavy metals in our soil and water, and that's going to end up in our food supply.
So it's not that what they care about and what they'd like to see change is different. It's that the way they're going about it is not genuinely rooted or reflected in the best science that we have available to us. And if that's the case, if I'm grasping that correctly, why is that? Why do they not see the science in the same way? And is this them ignoring the science that says otherwise because there are other incentives at play that are more important to this group? Or what is explaining these kind of decisions that we're seeing?
So it's tough for me to answer the question as to intent or reasons why they're doing it. I can speak to what is happening, but I would just kind of be speculating into why they're doing it. I mean, which I can do, but just to be clear, it's my speculation. I would think that the thing with the MAHA movement is that they have really focused on this idea of toxins, of corruption in our public health agencies, of corruption in science itself. And so I think that different factions have different reasons behind that. I think that I don't know that you have the MAHA movement without COVID, because I think that the COVID-19 pandemic really fueled a lot of this mistrust in public health. And they were kind of able to latch onto that and use that to kind of fuel even more distrust in public health in all of the agencies. And, from people most people don't really know what public health is or what people in the public health world do, right? Because public health is very much kind of like it operates pretty silently. And when it's working, you don't really think about it and you don't know it's working. So for example, when you drink your water out of the faucet and it's clean, you don't think of all of the regulations and all of the public health infrastructure that goes into getting you clean water. When you're breathing in clean air, you don't think of all the public health infrastructure. When you don't recognize an infectious disease that never actually became a pandemic because of public health infrastructure. Think about, the fact that we have a very safe food supply and we don't have a bunch of foodborne illness all the time. So that's public health, essentially. And they're kind of working behind the scenes. So I think it makes it really easy to kind of paint public health agencies as villainous. So to get back to your question though, I'm not exactly sure of the overall intent. But what I will say is that when you have a movement that really gets the problem largely right, but then misdiagnoses that problem in terms of what's causing those issues, then you're going to get the solutions wrong. And that's the problem with this movement is, as somebody who studied chronic disease, their main focus is chronic disease. And as somebody who studied that for 15 years, I could tell you that they're not focused on the main drivers of chronic disease in this country. So, and I can give you a really good example. The number one predictor of health in this country is wealth. So if you want to look at who is most impacted by chronic disease, and that's what we should do if we're looking at chronic disease, we're not all affected by lifestyle-related chronic disease equally. So there's populations of this country that are disproportionately impacted by chronic disease, and that tends to be low income and minority populations. So if you look at income distributions and you look at the highest income bracket versus the lowest income bracket, there's studies to show a 15-year life expectancy age gap for men and a 10-year life expectancy age gap for women between those two distributions. If you look at diabetes rates, twice as high of diabetes rates in the low income populations, 5 times more likely to report poor health. And so, just condition after condition, we see is disproportionately impacting low-income populations. So if you want to target chronic disease in this country, you have to target that group that is most impacted by chronic disease. And how do we do that? We do that through public health infrastructures. 2 of the biggest programs that can help, and we know can help from data, are expanding healthcare access and expanding nutrition assistance access. But what we're seeing with this administration is that they've defunded both of those. They've cut almost $1 trillion from Medicaid and, almost $200 billion from SNAP, which is our Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And so, again, if you're trying to decrease chronic disease, but you don't know the data that I just told you, and you don't know that those public health programs actually directly reduce chronic disease rates, and then you see that it's being defunded, maybe you don't recognize that that's actually going to do the exact opposite of what we want to see, which is decrease chronic disease rates in this country. One of the things we have going for us is the fact that no one has historically ever followed the dietary guidelines, and that's a negative generally, but in this case, it could potentially be a positive. And over 90% of Americans historically, since the guidelines came out, have never followed the dietary guidelines. And we know that if they were following the dietary guidelines prior to this iteration, we'd be better off in terms of looking at diet quality and dietary patterns.
My days can get pretty full on. Podcasting, research, training. So I'm always looking for simple ways to slow things down and anything that can support recovery. And one that has stuck of late is Peak's organic pu'er tea. It's actually a fermented food, and that's what really sets it apart from green or black tea. Because it's fermented, it's naturally rich in pre- and postbiotic compounds that help support a healthy gut environment. If you haven't heard much about postbiotics yet, you will. They're really the next chapter in gut health. Beneficial compounds produced during fermentation that keep supporting you even after the microbes themselves are deactivated from heat. Pu'er tea is also rich in an incredibly powerful class of polyphenols known as catechins and transform into short-chain fatty acids known to have anti-inflammatory effects, helping protect ourselves as we age and reduce our risk of developing chronic disease. And what makes Peak's organic pu'er tea extra special is its source, 250-year-old wild tea trees in untouched forests, some of the rarest and most nutrient-dense tea on planet Earth. Get 20% off site-wide for life, plus a complimentary holiday bundle at peaklife.com/Simon. That's PIQUE life.com/Simon. It seems crazy to me at a high level that people could be in a position of such power without knowing these things, without having the qualifications and the skills to look at the true underlying systems that are at play and what is driving that disparity in health across America.
Yeah, me too, Simon. I do know that within HHS, and there's been lots of reporting about this. So within our public health agencies, you have political appointees and then you have career scientists. And so the bulk of our public health agencies are made up of these career scientists. And so they are public health experts. They work no matter the administration, no matter at what political party they are, they do their same job. And they're really the backbone of our public health agencies. And then you have political appointees. So each president, depending on party, gets to choose their own political appointees. So that's, for example, the Secretary of HHS, right, which is RFK Jr. right now. Trump appointed him. And then he has his own political appointees within HHS. And the political appointees usually very much rely on the career scientists within these public health agencies, whether it's the FDA or the CDC or wherever it is. And what we know to be true now, because of a lot of reporting from many people within HHS, is that the political appointees are not working with the scientists and the career scientists right now. And so they're really relying on the political appointees, which means that what's being done is a lot of what we're seeing is very ideological, which is not what we're used to seeing within HHS, particularly with people who tend to work with the career scientists. And so, yeah, I'm not exactly sure why, but it's very concerning, obviously, for public health.
Yeah, I've had Dr. Christopher Gardner from Stanford on the show a number of times, and I know he was involved in the Dietary Guidelines Committee that provided recommendations for the upcoming dietary guidelines. And it surprised me to see recent headlines that, RFK Jr. has come out and said, saturated fat-rich foods are kind of back on the menu in the new American dietary guidelines, because at least in my conversations with Dr. Gardner, it seemed to me that they were very much, still recommending dietary patterns that limit saturated fats and promote the consumption of other foods instead.
Yeah, so the dietary guidelines, they come out every 5 years, and they usually, how it works is there's a scientific advisory committee, so of nutrition scientists and people working on that dietary or that scientific advisory guidelines for 2 years. So this past group just submitted their scientific report that they worked on for 2 years, where they go through all of the nutrition science research, everything that's available globally, and identify dietary patterns that are most healthful for the general population, because that's what the dietary guidelines are. What can we recommend for the vast majority of people to reduce risk of these chronic diseases? And so they just submitted that report beginning of 2025, and RFK Jr. said that they're not going to use that scientific advisory report, and instead they're going to create their own dietary guidelines that are 4 to 5 pages long. And yeah, there's been reporting that one of the things that they're planning to do is to recommend increasing saturated fat, which is absolutely not what was in the scientific report for the dietary guidelines, not what's in line with current literature, certainly not what we would suggest as a recommendation for the general population of the United States. We're not in a saturated fat deficiency in the United States.
And again, this might be hard for you to answer, and perhaps you already have, and that it could just be ideological and his personal belief. But what do you think is driving that position? Why is RFK Jr., pro animal fats and foods like meat and dairy, while simultaneously kind of pointing the finger at sugar? Why is that his position when the rest of, or at least the scientific kind of consensus and most of academia would say, multiple things can contribute to a diet quality being low, and yes, we should reduce, added refined sugars and reduce ultra processed foods, but we should also limit our consumption of saturated fat?
I think it's because he's surrounding himself with people who have these kind of like views of nutrition science. I think he's mentioned that he follows a carnivore-esque diet before. So I think he's taking kind of like his personal beliefs and extrapolating that to what dietary guidance should be for the general population. I mean, I don't think it's any bigger than that. I think that's kind of the whole crux of it.
We're in this kind of funny time, I think, where people are often choosing to trust influencers or people in government that do not have qualifications on the subject matter they're talking about over experts. Why do you think it is that people like Casey Means or RFK Jr. can often out-communicate most PhDs? And what should scientists learn from that?
I think that there's a few reasons. One, you don't really get into science because you're a good communicator. That's not really the requisite to get into the field. And unfortunately, we don't I worked in science communication after I left academia, and I always viewed myself as kind of like a translator between the PhD scientists and the business people, and a lot of scientists will say this, that for forever, we have written in a language that's not accessible to people. We speak in a language that's not accessible to people. We publish work behind paywalls that are not accessible to people. And I think that that's a huge issue, and we haven't prioritized or valued science communication. So that just has not been something that has been valued in the scientific community for a very long time. And now I think we're seeing a shift because we're seeing how important science communication is. But, we've valued science communication to one another at conferences or debating in peer-reviewed publications, not necessarily to the general population. And we had some good science communicators in like our public health agencies, but much of what they were doing was being published on websites that people never went to. And it was quite frowned upon for us to go to where people were going for their information, which for better or worse is social media. And so, because of that, people couldn't put a face to scientists. They couldn't put a face to people working in these public health agencies. And when you can't put a face to somebody and you don't see that they're human, just like you, and I think you have to kind of like have a connection with somebody before you trust them. And it's much easier to trust somebody who you kind of like see as human or have a connection with. And we never have had that in the sciences where we're going to people. And so I think that's been a real issue for us. And I think that because we had that kind of, I tell this story sometimes, but the first year of I was a tenure track professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and there was a new app out, and my little brother convinced me to go on it. And I went on just to start. He was like, just go teach your nutrition courses. You're teaching every day at the university. Just do the same thing and you'll reach thousands of people instead of the hundreds that are in your class. And so I was like, oh, good idea. So I started going on every day on this app and just teaching the exact same information. And I got a little following on there. And I got a lot of pushback from my colleagues and former colleagues and people who just, it was very taboo to go on social media. People making fun of me, being like, how's your vlogging doing? And because I was a brand new tenure track professor, I didn't want to risk my career. And so I just got off after a few months and never went back until, years later. And I think that was the case. I talked to a lot of academics and a lot of medical professionals, and that was the case for a lot of us, for a lot of people. And because of that, we lost a lot of ground and a lot of years on these platforms that's where people were going. And we can talk about maybe why people go there for their information as well. But that's where people were going for their information. And so we allowed the narrative to kind of be taken by people who maybe didn't have the best interest of people at heart.
Yeah, right. There's a lot of things went unchallenged. But it's nice to see now there seems to be much greater acceptance in the role of scientists on social media and helping educate the public, not only about the specifics of certain topics, but also just more generally around how to be discerning and sort of improve your scientific literacy to an extent.
Yeah. It's like that thing about like what is it, like teaching a man to fish? I don't even know. I shouldn't have brought it up. I don't know the actual quote, but it's like, the idea would be to like help to increase people's scientific literacy and also media literacy, right? So that we don't have to correct every single video out there because that's impossible to do. But you can start to identify some of these trends that happen on social media and spot them and be like, oh, maybe I shouldn't trust that information that I'm seeing.
I think it's something like give a man a fish he can eat for a day and teach him how to fish and he can feed his family for the rest of his life or something like that. But we all got it. We all got it. Back on the dietary guidelines for a moment here. Are you concerned about the effect that these new guidelines, if they are published in the way that RFK Jr. is proposing, are you concerned on the effect that they could have on the American public?
One of the things we have going for us is the fact that no one has historically ever followed the dietary guidelines. And so, that's a negative generally, but in this case, it could potentially be a positive. Over 90% of Americans historically, since the guidelines came out, have never followed the dietary guidelines. And we know that if they were following the dietary guidelines prior to this iteration, we'd be better off in terms of looking at diet quality and dietary patterns. And so I don't know how big of an impact it will actually have. If we look at saturated fat intake right now, Americans are overwhelmingly eating more than the recommended amount of saturated fat, which right now is about 10%. And I think when I looked at the last NHANES data, we're eating anywhere from 12 to 13% saturated fat. So on average, we're eating more saturated fat than is recommended. I don't know how many people will just kind of like deliberately change their dietary eating patterns because of the new dietary guidelines. But this administration is very good at using social media and media kind of sources and getting messages out more so than we've ever been. And so I think that potentially it could influence people to kind of just think, oh, I can be eating more bacon. I can be eating more of this. It's not actually unhealthy for me anymore like it used to be. So I'm not sure. If I was hypothesizing, I would say we would probably not see a huge change in terms of intake, just because historically we haven't seen the guidelines really move the needle. But they do certainly influence our federal nutrition programs. And so we use the dietary guidelines in terms of what we're offering for school meals or SNAP or programs like that. And so they can have an impact there. But I don't know what he's actually going to come out and say, because I don't think the announcement has been made yet.
Yeah, just thinking about this on the fly, because that adherence piece that you were talking about makes complete sense. Historically, very few people have been able to adhere to the guidelines. So how influential are they actually? I think the difference here might be in the fact that the recommendations are kind of reinforcing foods that people love and want to hear are healthy versus eating more fruit and veg. So perhaps that could have a different effect, as you say. But that also gets me thinking just generally about that dietary guideline adherence piece there. And I'm sure you come across this a lot. A lot of people kind of really blame the 1980 dietary guidelines in particular for America's kind of health predicament today, and sort of point to the increase in obesity and metabolic diseases since 1980 and say, look at these guidelines that said limit saturated fat, said to eat low fat, etc., and people got unhealthier. Yet the issue that they seem to be overlooking is that dietary adherence piece that you're talking to.
Yes, there's a lot of information out there that blames the food pyramid on a lot of our issues today. And I always try to point out to people that the food pyramid was not followed by over 90% of Americans. So they were not following the recommendations of the food guide pyramid. I think that what this is it's a conflation of correlation and causation. You can take the food pyramid. The food pyramid came out then, and we've seen an increase in obesity. You could also take several things that have increased since then and say that that was the cause of obesity, right? That's a correlation. That doesn't necessarily mean that one of those things causes the other. So when you're looking at the food pyramid, and you're seeing the dietary, and the food pyramid, by the way, was the visual representation of the dietary guidelines. And so just like my plate today is the visual representation of the dietary guidelines. I think some people might still think that we use the food pyramid. The original food pyramid has not been used since 2005. And we've been using a plate since 2011, since the Obama administration. So that's 14 years at this point. We've been using a plate, which kind of shows like, make half your plate fruits and vegetables. But those are visual representations. And the dietary guidelines themselves, I don't think people realize this, but they haven't actually changed all that much since the original dietary guidelines. We've had some modifications, some shifts, but even the grains recommendation, which everyone kind of harps on, because we put the grains at the bottom of the food pyramid, and I say I wasn't around, but the grains were at the bottom of the food pyramid, so it kind of like looked like that was because of the way a pyramid is, right? You have to have something at the bottom, and so grains were at the bottom, and that was because the original food pyramid showed a huge range, so it was like 6 to 11 servings of grains. And that's because it was acknowledged that's the category that can be most variable for people depending on activity level. So if you have a really active person, they can consume more carbohydrates from things like grains. Whereas if you have a less active person, they should be more on the 6 servings of grains side. Right now, our dietary guidelines recommend 6 servings of grains. It's not in the same serving, but it's 6 ounce equivalents, which is basically 6 servings of grains. And so I don't know that, I think that a lot of people don't realize it hasn't actually shifted all that much. We took away the range, and that's largely because we realized that most Americans are quite inactive. And so there's not the need for that range on a generalized guidance for people. But yeah, the recommendations themselves within the dietary guidelines are fairly similar. It's just the visual representation changed. So now we use a plate, and some people think that we should go back to the visual representation of the pyramid because it was more evidence-based, but I think it was a bit confusing for people. Coca-Cola just just came out with a brand new product offering that uses cane sugar instead of high fructose corn syrup. They didn't get rid of high fructose corn syrup. They're just adding a product to their existing product line, which, by the way, was already available to us. We could already buy Mexican Coke. We can buy it on DoorDash right now. But now we're going to use cane sugar from the US and make this Coke offering. And it's being promoted as this health win. And the problem is that people are going to see that as a health win. And it could lead to people drinking more Coca-Cola because our HHS secretary is promoting it. Our president is promoting it. And it's just a new product offering for Coca-Cola.
My nutrition philosophy has always been pretty simple. Start with a healthy, plant-rich dietary pattern built around whole foods. That is the single most important nutrition move that you can make when it comes to optimizing your health. But even with a great diet, even with the best diet out there, many of us are still susceptible to falling short on our intake of key essential nutrients. That's where IM8 Daily Ultimate Essentials comes in. Daily Ultimate Essentials was formulated by yours truly, alongside previous guests of The Proof, Dr. Dawn Mussalem, Dr. Suzanne Devkota, and Dr. David Katz. With the right dosage and forms of essential nutrients like vitamin D3, B12, iodine, selenium, zinc, and choline, IM8 was formulated to help you optimize your essential nutrient intake to support your energy levels, cognition, mood, metabolism, and overall well-being. It's also NSF certified for sport, which means that every ingredient is third-party tested before blending, and every single batch is tested after blending to confirm that the active ingredients on the label are in the product in the right quantities and nothing more. In a world where supplements are underregulated and many supplement companies are cutting corners to keep their costs down and boost their profits, it makes sense to me to buy supplements that are NSF certified for sport where possible. For listeners of The Proof, IM8 is offering 10% off your first order. Head to im8health.com and use the code Simon at checkout. That's im8health.com. Code Simon for foundational nutrition that's clinically backed, tested for purity, and built for performance. What about the kind of shift from talking about individual nutrients? And again, in the headlines, we're seeing saturated fat being kind of zoomed in on and dominating the conversation versus shifting the conversation more to an overall dietary patterns like other countries have tended to do in their guidelines.
I mean, the evidence backs us up on this, that you have to think about overall diet quality, and that considers the entire dietary pattern of somebody, right? And so the interesting thing about the guidelines is that when we talk about foods to include, we use the language of the food itself. So we say, eat more fruits, eat more vegetables. When we talk about things to withhold or to limit, we talk about individual nutrients. Eat less saturated fat, eat less sodium, eat less added sugar, and not actual foods. And so I think that can be very confusing for people because people think in terms of food. They don't think in terms of these individual nutrients. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that if we say, eat less meat, which, has been attempted before. We have some very strong lobbying industries in this country that will say, hey, can we actually not say eat less meat and let's say eat less saturated fat instead? So, or choose lean meats, which I think is what the language is, instead of eat less high saturated fat meats. So yeah, I definitely think that if we're looking at the best approach for the dietary guidelines, it would be to speak in terms of like foods that people are actually consuming versus just nutrients themselves.
Speaking of lobbying, I think we're kind of in this weird position because I think a lot of people who are influenced by RFK Jr. currently believe that the dietary guidelines have been heavily influenced, bought and paid for by the food industry, and that they're not science-based, the guidelines that you're speaking to. And so they see the proposals that he's putting forward and are led to believe that he's really coming in and cleaning things up. Do you understand how someone could have lost faith, trust in the government and the dietary guidelines and its health recommendations because of relationship with the industry and sort of misaligned incentives?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because this is something I've been talking about since I was in graduate school and the process of the dietary guidelines. I think what gets lost is the nuance of the entire thing. So, the way that it's kind of put forth by a lot of people is that you can't trust the dietary guidelines because they're just bought and paid for by these industries. And, you can go back and in every iteration of the guidelines, you can go find that scientific advisory report because this is the way that it works, right? You have again, 2 years of scientists working on this scientific advisory report, going through all the nutrition science. And that is a very scientific, straightforward, evidence-based kind of thing that happens, right? A report that comes out. So you can go back and see what is recommended in that versus what ends up in the actual dietary guidelines. And, I think the way that it's kind of being presented is there's huge gaps there. There's big changes and you can't trust the dietary guidelines because, again, they're bought and paid for. But what you'll find is that there's very small changes generally. So it might be something like I mentioned with the meat. Like the scientific advisory report might come out and say, hey, we should be eating less meat. And then what happens is once they submit that advisory report, then all the lobbying can start happening and people can be like, oh, we don't want that. We don't want this. Like that's harmful to our industry. And so, the meat industry, the cattle industry might come in and be like, let's just soften the language. Could we just soften that language and not say eat less meat? Let's say choose lean meats. Let's say decrease saturated fat. So you see like some of these like language changes, but in terms of like giant, or maybe like with grains in the first iteration of the dietary guidelines, I think there should have been an emphasis on whole grains. Now we do have an emphasis on whole grains, but I think there was some changes where it just kind of like they presented all grains as the same. And I think that was due to some of the lobbying that came in and they were just like, okay, we're going to, instead of saying like make half of your grains whole grains, we're just going to put grains out there and just say like choose 6 to 11 servings of grains. And so I think, again, it's kind of in some of the way it's presented, but in terms of the overall dietary pattern that's presented in the dietary guidelines, it's very in line with what scientific research and scientific evidence would show. And again, I just have to keep reiterating, over 90% of us do not follow the dietary guidelines. And there's evidence to show, we look at dietary patterns, that if people did follow the dietary guidelines at every iteration over the last however many years they've been out, diet quality would improve and people's health outcomes would improve.
And what you're saying is that most of the explanation for why people are not following the dietary guidelines is not necessarily confusion. For example, saying eat less saturated fat instead of saying eat less of food A, B, C, but it's actually larger systems across the country.
Absolutely.
Okay, and I want to get to those systems and kind of better understand them and maybe what some of the potential solutions are. But just while we're speaking about food and some of the things that MAHA have put forward, you mentioned additives before, and one of the things that they put a lot of effort into from a press point of view was this targeting of food dyes, Red 40 in particular. What would you say to someone who says, in Europe, that they don't allow these ingredients and they're way healthier than Americans, so why not target them?
Yeah, I think that you have to kind of understand what the differences between us and Europe are, but also let's just talk regulation, for example, for a second, because how this is presented a lot of times is that, and it plays into this kind of like conspiratorial narrative that this movement really relies on, and it's the idea that all of these countries across the world that have better health outcomes in terms of chronic disease, which is really what we're talking about, lifestyle-related chronic disease. So they have better health outcomes when it comes to that. They don't allow artificial food dye in their food. And, you'll hold up to cereal bags and show the difference in color between us and another country and say, America is basically allowing all of this stuff in our food, and that's the reason that we're unhealthy. And that's just not the case. So from a regulatory perspective, our regulatory body is the FDA. I think people confuse this sometimes, but food dyes have to go through full regulation for the FDA in order to be released. And so we have 5 synthetic food dyes that are used in our food supply, and that's red 40, yellow 5, yellow 6, blue 1, and blue 2. Now, those food dyes do not have any redeeming nutritional qualities to them. They certainly are used in foods that are these ultra-processed foods, generally that are targeted at children, generally that are high in sugar, devoid of other nutrition, and it's very much a marketing thing for these food companies. So I think there's a nuance here to understand that when I'm explaining this and when I'm explaining these differences and kind of the misinformation that's out there about them, I'm not advocating for synthetic food dyes because, again, they're in these foods that I would recommend that we consume less of and we regulate heavier. For example, I think we should regulate food marketing to children, and a lot of those foods contain these synthetic food dyes. But we also have to understand that there is a reason that these dyes dyes are used. And it's for this kind of, there's like a psychological factor to eating for us. It's the same reason they put like dye into salmon on the fish counter in the grocery store, because if you see that it's a bit discolored, you're going to think that it's bad and you're not going to want to buy it. And food corporations know this. So they use these synthetic food dyes because they're more stable than natural food dyes a lot of the times. And so the batches are the same. With natural food dyes, it's kind of like depends on some of the growing season, depending on what you're using. And there can be variability within each batch. And consumers don't tend to like that. So anyway, back to your question about the difference between, let's say, European countries or Australia or here. Regulation-wise, all 5 of those synthetic food dyes are completely allowed to be used in every single EU country, in Australia, in Canada, in these countries that we always compare ourselves to. So it's not that the United States is allowing them and other countries have banned them. They're not banned anywhere else. The difference is that they're not used as much. And so why is that? In a lot of ways, it's because corporations are making what consumers demand. And so in the United States, we tend to demand, and when I say demand, it's what we're buying, these bright colored cereals, these bright colored candies. Like if I grew up in the 90s as a kid and I remember the commercials on the screen with the mascots and the like bright colored things. And I think it's just kind of like become a big part of our culture, this kind of food. Whereas in other countries, it's not. They don't need the bright colored food as much, right? And so I think there's a difference there. So you have to think of why we're using them so much versus other countries, but it's not from a regulation perspective. It's not because we don't allow them or we allow them and other countries do not allow them.
So it's a response to the American public's conditioning around what food should look like. And if these ingredients weren't being used, then more food would be rejected.
Yeah, because Simon, we haven't even gotten into this yet, but we have endorsed and we have reinforced a food environment that is very much built for corporate profit at the expense of our health. And so the goal of corporations and food corporations is to maximize profit and growth at the expense of all other values. So it's not that, you'll see like conspiratorial videos a lot that are like, they're trying to keep the American people sick because then they have to be reliant on healthcare and it's all for profit. It's not that. It's just that they don't care if the food makes you sick or not, right? That's not their main priority. Their main priority is profit and growth in our capitalist economy that prioritizes profit and growth. And you have to show profit and growth to Wall Street every 90 days. And so that's what they're doing. And it just so happens that synthetic food dyes that make food really bright happen to sell better in the United States.
Yep. What are you going to pick up off the shelf? What are you going to enjoy the taste of, and what will you buy again?
And we know this to be true because back in 2015, General Mills, they were thinking that people wanted these more natural food dyes, right? And so they were thinking that they were responding to this idea that there was more demand for these natural food dyes, which I think was kind of popular at the time on social media. And so they committed to removing them, and they removed the synthetic food dyes from Lucky Charms and I think Trix. I don't know. I'm not exactly sure which ones, but from many of their cereals. And it only lasted, I think, 2 years before they put the synthetic food dyes back because the demand just wasn't there for them. And I know they got a lot of like people upset and, actual people purchasing the products wanted them back.
So you would classify this attention on Red 40 as more of a distraction than something that's really going to shift the needle?
I think it's an intentional distraction because it plays into a conspiratorial narrative of our regulatory agencies not doing their job. And I think that that plays really well into this narrative. And I think that if you look at what is actually causing the issues in this country, and you think about if you take Skittles and you swap out red dye 40 and you put in red natural food coloring from Carmine or from beet juice, Carmine is from bugs, by the way, and you use those instead of red dye 40, it's still Skittles. It's still a high sugar, nutrient devoid, ultra processed food. You're not going to see better health outcomes by doing that.
Makes me think about the media story around, I'm not sure what fast food chain it was that swapped out seed oils for beef tallow.
We don't need to mention
deep
them.
Fried chips.
Yeah.
We don't need to give them airtime, But it seems like a similar thing where it's this big kind of, PR newsworthy topic, but is changing that fat really going to positively influence someone's diet quality?
Yeah, and I mean we keep seeing this I just did something on this because our HHS secretary, which runs our Health and Human Services Department, continuously posts about these candy companies and these ultra-processed food companies making these like ingredient swaps in their otherwise exact same ultra-processed foods. You know, they did it with like Swedish fish. They're changing out their color. It's still Swedish fish. It's still candy. And we're promoting them. And, you know, what happens is Coca-Cola just came out with a brand new product offering that uses cane sugar instead of high fructose corn syrup. They didn't get rid of high fructose corn syrup. They're just adding a product to their existing product line, which, by the way, was already available to us. We could already buy Mexican Coke. We can buy it on DoorDash right now. But now we're going to use cane sugar from the US and make this Coke offering. And it's being promoted as this health win. And the problem is that people are going to see that as a health win. And it could lead to people drinking more Coca-Cola because our HHS secretary is promoting it. Our president is promoting it, and it's just a new product offering for Coca-Cola. We don't need to be promoting Coca-Cola and promoting people, like helping people to think that it's healthier so that they ultimately drink more of it.
Are they genuinely convinced that cane sugar is significantly better for metabolic health and obesity than high fructose corn syrup?
It certainly seems that way, which the evidence does not support at all. High fructose corn syrup is refined sugar that comes from corn. We happen to use it a lot in the United States because we heavily subsidize corn in this country. We grow corn really well and we subsidize corn. And so we grow a lot of it. And because of other kind of economic policies where we put quotas on importing sugarcane, for example, to protect our corn farmers, ultra-processed food companies used corn as a sugar source. And so that's why we started using a lot of high fructose corn syrup in our ultra-processed foods, because we just grow corn really well. In the EU, they grow sugar beet really well. So they use sugar beet quite often. Whereas in Mexico, they use cane sugar in their soda because they grow that better there. And so, you know, I think people don't realize that. And it's a really easy thing to be like, oh, high fructose corn syrup, again, the United States poisoning their food with this worse or inferior sugar source, which it's just not. I mean, they're both made up of glucose and fructose. Cane sugar, again, it's just refined sugar from sugarcane. High fructose corn syrup is just refined sugar from corn. Both are made up of fairly similar amounts of glucose and fructose, which create the sugar. And if you look at all of the metabolic studies, all of them show overwhelmingly that they have a very similar metabolic impact on our health.
This is going back to what you said at the beginning of the conversation where MAHA can be dangerous, because I think that most people would agree we should reduce consumption of high fructose corn syrup and sugar sweetened beverages.
Yes.
Then the question becomes like, how do we do that in a way that positively shifts the needle? What you're saying is that this kind of reformulation from a company like Coca-Cola might even lead to people consuming more sugar-sweetened beverages and may have a deleterious effect. So if we were to take this as a good kind of example here to contrast MAHA's way of thinking versus yours on an intervention level, is there an example from another country or some type of blueprint that we have available to us, a system kind of wide intervention that would better promote the reduction of consumption of these sugar sweetened beverages?
Yeah, I mean, soda taxes are the best thing that we've seen in public health that can be helpful. That's just essentially putting a tax on. It worked with cigarettes, for example. These taxes work. It's worked in other places where we've seen soda taxes before. When you increase the cost of the soda, it will decrease consumption. And they've been very difficult to implement because there's a lot of lobbying against soda taxes because we know that it works to reduce consumption. So something like that, which is a regulation, which it's very fascinating about this MAHA movement. They talk a lot about things that they want that require regulation while having a very deregulatory approach to it all. And so, something like a sugar tax, again, requires some sort of policy change or regulation, whereas something like swapping cane sugar and having Coca-Cola offer a new product with cane sugar that you're then going to turn around as a government and promote, wonderful for Coca-Cola. They're probably very happy with all of that.
Right, but if you are legitimately trying to change chronic disease in this country, I understand there's lobbying and the industries don't like sugar tax. But like if I was in charge and I was hearing all of this information from you, it would seem a no-brainer to me to introduce that tax irrespective of what the actual industry is saying, because I know that their number one priority isn't public health.
Yeah. Me too, but that's not how our government works. Instead of funding the FDA more to get more scientists so that we could kind of decrease that backlog, what they did is they said, okay, what we're going to do is if an ingredient is generally recognized as safe, we're going to tell the corporations that they can go through the same process that we go through at the FDA. They can hire their own scientists and they can decide if it's generally recognized as safe or not. So it never even had to go through the FDA, and then it was optional. They could submit their findings to the FDA or not. And so what that did is it resulted in lots of food additives that the FDA may not even know is in the food supply, right? They don't have all of the data to see.
Today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Just a few days ago, I had a beautiful hour or so long conversation with a friend of mine, Jonathan. And in this conversation, we talked about everything, how things were going in my relationship with Tawny, what's been on his mind lately and on his heart, and even a bit of evolutionary science in there for good measure. And when we hung up, I felt lighter, I felt clearer, and I went about my day in a great mood. And this conversation reminded me how powerful it is to have someone to talk to, an outlet, a sounding board, someone who listens without judgment. And that's what therapy is really about. It's not about fixing you or fixing me. It's about creating space to better understand ourselves. BetterHelp makes that first step so much easier. Their therapists are fully licensed and carefully matched to you through a very short questionnaire. And if your first match isn't quite right, you can switch anytime. So this month, don't wait to reach out, whether it's checking in on a friend or connecting with a therapist yourself. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/theproof. That's betterhelp.com/theproof. It seems like, what are we not understanding here? Like, why is it not that simple for the government that comes in who cares about chronic disease to make these policy changes?
Because our corporations in this country have an immense amount of influence over our politics and over the policies that get implemented. And so a lot of that goes back to our campaign finance system. And, you know, I'm often asked, like, what's the number one thing you would do to improve public health? And I think, like, people will think I'll say something like improve the food supply, which I would, improve the built environment, all of these types of things that are obviously directly related to health. But actually, my number one thing would be to campaign finance reform. And the reason for that is because right now we have a campaign finance system that essentially allows corporations and wealthy individuals to spend unlimited amounts of money to influence campaigns. And when you have someone who has been, elected to office, that has been elected to office because of a few donors, those donors can have immense influence over the policies that you enact. And the thing about public health is that they are not what's best generally for corporate profits. And so what we find is that we can have really good evidence for something and want to see policy enacted based on that evidence, but that policy doesn't actually get enacted because it would hurt corporate profits. And this is across the board. And I think it's very important for people to understand, because I think this is how we've kind of had this narrative going about, like, distrusting science as if the evidence has been really corrupted. And that's why we're all unhealthy. And it's actually quite the opposite. It's that we have very good evidence, but the policy, we haven't enacted good policy that is evidence-based public health policy to a large extent because of the way that our campaign finance system works.
Right. I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. So I'll donate to your political party as long as you don't regulate my industry in a way that reduces my profits.
Yeah, exactly.
If only the health insurance companies could lobby as hard and with as deep pockets as the food industry, because I suspect that the health insurance companies would stand to benefit from greater policy.
Yeah, it's about the only corporation that I think could probably benefit from people being healthier.
So what is it going to take to have reform there such that those financial ties do not exist?
Well, so we have a Supreme Court decision that happened in 2010 that I like to talk about called Citizens United. And Citizens United was essentially, again, a Supreme Court I can go back through the history. It actually started with Hillary Clinton. And there was this conservative group that wanted to create this, basically a hit piece about Hillary Clinton in 2008, right before the campaign or right before the election. And at that time, corporations and entities like this couldn't do that. You couldn't influence kind of campaigns. And so the FEC came in and said, essentially, you guys can't do this. And Citizens United sued, saying that it was against their First Amendment right to free speech. And that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And essentially, the Supreme Court ruled that corporations were people and had First Amendment rights just like people did. And what that did, it wasn't just about this one documentary that they were putting out about Hillary Clinton. What it did is it completely changed campaign finance in this country. And it allowed corporations and wealthy donors to flow campaigns with, or not necessarily directly. So you can't directly contribute to a political candidate, but it's what super PACs are. So now we had an explosion of super PACs where these corporations could just flood it with millions and millions of dollars to then influence the campaign. So they could make tons of commercials and advertising. And now I think they can work with influencers because social media is such a big thing, right? To put out all of this kind of messaging against a candidate or for a candidate, whichever it is. And so that is really if you were starting somewhere, it would be working. And we have groups in this country that are working to change Citizens United. It's a difficult thing to change, obviously, a Supreme Court ruling, but I think we need to talk about it more. And I think more people need to understand that particular Supreme Court ruling really changed the way that our politics are run and the way that policy is run. And if we want to kind of have campaign finance reform, it starts there. Ideally, Bernie Sanders has been talking about campaign finance reform forever, but ideally we would have candidates who aren't taking kind of super PAC money and don't these big, large donors that they're then indebted to kind of, obviously enact policy that is not harmful to those corporations. But yeah, that's really what it would take it would be to start actually understanding the root of it, and then looking to bring people into office. And we're seeing that kind of this younger generation of candidates that are coming in who, are kind of like grassroots organizers and are not taking this big donor money.
So there is some reason to be hopeful, because the cynical side of me, as I'm sitting here and listening to all of this, if I'm just being completely candid, is I feel really sad about the people that are negatively affected by this system, a system that you're describing that seems really unjust and unfair and rigged, and are struggling to eat a healthy diet, are dealing with the consequences of chronic disease in their family, dealing with family members having low quality of life, family members not living as long as they otherwise could have. It feels difficult for me to see this changing. It feels unlikely, unrealistic. And so I can sit in that kind of very pessimistic, cynical state. And that's not a great place for us to live in. So it's nice to hear you kind of put something forward that can give us some hope.
I think it's really important to identify how you're feeling right now, too, because it's the reason that narratives like we can swap food dyes and we'll get healthier. We can swap this sugar source in soda and we'll get healthier. I think it's the reason that messaging like that catches on, because when you start to think about the systems, it can feel very overwhelming. When I start to talk about how convoluted everything is, and, it goes back to campaign finance reform, and you have to kind of you have to connect the dots from that to the public health policy to what people are choosing to eat every day. It's big and it feels overwhelming. And I agree with you that it can feel insurmountable. And so I think that's the reason that it's really important for us to kind of have these conversations and put forth not just paint a bleak picture of what we're dealing with right now, which is, it is bleak, but to also talk about solutions, because there are solutions and there are things that we can be doing. The thing is, though, we have to get people more understanding of the problems and the root problems to be able to kind of move forward in terms of kind of the energy and push the energy into changes that can actually impact us and improve our health overall.
And speaking of those solutions, earlier you mentioned SNAP. And there seems to be a whole lot of confusion around what SNAP is and who it helps, if it helps anyone at all. Can you bring people up to speed with what SNAP is and why is there this kind of controversy right now?
Sure. SNAP is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So it used to be called food stamps. So a lot of people probably know it as food stamps. It's our main nutrition assistance program in this country. It impacts 42 million people on an average year, and including 16 million children. So it impacts 1 in 5 children in this country. It is a way to kind of help people bridge the gap in order to get them to be able to afford groceries, and it directly reduces food insecurity. So it's one of our biggest programs that we have to help reduce poverty in the country. It helps lift people out of poverty, but also directly reduces food insecurity by up to 30% in some populations. And so because of that, it requires kind of a budget allocation. So, it's an entitlement program. So it gets funding. It's about 1.5% of our total tax spend every single year goes to SNAP. And again, that's to feed 1 in 8 Americans, or to help feed 1 in 8 Americans. And the average SNAP benefit for a person is about $212 a month. So it's not like they're getting this huge amount for groceries, but it's very helpful to people to help meet their nutrient needs. So, again, the goal is to decrease food insecurity, which we know directly impacts chronic disease rates, but also a number of other health outcomes. And so that's what SNAP is really intended to do. It's intended to decrease food insecurity, and 80% of benefits go to families who either have somebody who's elderly, disabled, or have children. And so the vast majority of those benefits are going to households with those people, those demographics.
And so what's the controversy surrounding this right now, and perhaps what are people getting wrong or confused by with regards to the SNAP program?
Yeah, I think people don't understand its core public health infrastructure. It's our core public health nutrition program. And I think that a lot of people don't understand it's not just kind of like free money handouts for nothing. Like the program itself, which I think is very important to point out, it doesn't just decrease food insecurity and with health outcomes, it also is very economically efficient. So every dollar that goes into SNAP generates $1.50 to $1.80 in economic activity. Because if you think about it, the amount that they're getting each month goes right back into the economy. It goes right back into purchasing food at stores. So it's an incredibly effective and efficient program. I think that because it's an entitlement program that, again, a core public health program, but it's 1.5% of our tax spend. And so there are certain people in politics who don't want to be funding it and haven't for a long time. They've tried to, try to defund public health programs overall. And so there's a narrative out there that it's wasteful or people are abusing the system, and people will abuse Eddie's system. I think there's SNAP itself, fraud rates are extremely low, less than 1 to 2%. But I think a lot of people will focus on that 1% and then use that as an excuse to say the whole program is not great, when I like to focus on the 99% that are incredibly helpful for people. I hear from people all the time because I talk about SNAP a lot because I'm a very big SNAP advocate. And if you see the actual data, it's hard to not be. But I hear from them how I was on SNAP for 3 years when I was raising my kids, and it helped us to get to the next level where now we're making a lot more money and we're able to give back. Those are a lot of the SNAP stories out there. But I think it's really easy for people to kind of focus on maybe stories that are not as helpful. But yeah, overall, core public health nutrition infrastructure is incredibly important to decrease food insecurity in this country, and one of the most important public health programs we have.
And so what are the real world consequences that people should be aware of if this program was to be defunded?
Yeah, well, we're facing that right now. It's possible that SNAP benefits won't go out next month. We're currently in a government shutdown just while we're recording this. I'm not sure when it will go out. And so, 42 million people are at risk of not getting their benefits next month. What we will see is a surge in people going to food pantries and food banks. We're already seeing increases in that, but food banks, they don't have the capacity to kind of make up for the loss of SNAP funding. And so what you'll see food insecurity rise. Again, SNAP directly reduces food insecurity. We know that by a lot of data. So if you remove those SNAP benefits for families, they will see food insecurity increase. We'll see families have to make choices between buying food, paying their bills, paying their rent. We'll see, obviously, credit card debt increase. And you'll see health outcomes decrease. And so, if you're really concerned, again, chronic disease negatively impacts low-income populations. disproportionately much higher than any other population in the country. And SNAP is a very important public health program that helps that demographic of people. And so if you remove that, I mean, there's a reason it exists, and it's because it works and it helps decrease food insecurity. If you remove it, you'll increase food insecurity and you'll decrease health outcomes.
And I have to imagine as well, and this is not something I've looked into, so I'm speculating that when you squeeze people that much financially and constrain access to food, a normal human response would be desperation. And as such, you would think the crime rate and things of that nature would go up. Not to say that they are bad people, but if you put people in that situation, then that's an outcome that you could expect to see. So right now we're in this government shutdown period, and that could result in kind of temporary defunding, 42 million people not getting access to SNAP. But beyond that, is RFK Jr. and the Republicans, are they proposing to completely get rid of SNAP, or are they just suggesting reform? Because I have read online in certain publications, and I'm not sure of the accuracy of this, that they're more promoting reform and just wanting to make sure that the SNAP funds are going towards healthier foods.
Yeah, so we have to separate a little bit about what's happening right now during the shutdown with what is going on kind of at the federal funding level with funding bills. And so in July, the Republicans passed the Big Beautiful Bill is what they called it. So which was basically a bill that cut nearly $200 billion from SNAP. Now, the way that we know that is, and they did that through a series of kind of like just decisions, but the overall kind of outcome would be a cut of about just shy of $200 billion. I think it's $186 billion. And one of the main ways they're doing that is through something called work requirements, which, you can place work requirements on people. But the outcome would be, and we know this through work requirements for other things like Medicaid, some states have issued these work requirements before. Work requirements are really just paperwork requirements. So we don't see an increase in people who are actually working more hours, and we do see a decrease in people who actually get their benefits, who qualify for their benefits, because they can't navigate the system to go through all of that paperwork, for example. So that's why, again, they're called paperwork requirements. And that's one of the ways. They're also reducing the amount of federal dollars that they're giving to states. And so states will take on more of the burden for SNAP. And some states will be able to make that up. Other states won't prioritize that. And so you may see some like disjointed, it just won't be as kind of like even across the country for SNAP benefits. So that's in the Republican bill that passed in July. So that's an expectation. One of the things they also cut within SNAP was SNAP Ed, which is the SNAP education program, which makes absolutely no sense if you're in the MAHA movement, because SNAP Ed was an incredible program that helped people who were getting SNAP benefits. Basically, they could get education on how to use those benefits to purchase healthier foods, how to purchase those healthy foods and then cook healthful meals on a budget. And there were some awesome dietitians working in that program, helping people to learn how to eat healthier and to prepare healthier foods. And they cut that entire program within that budget cut. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is right now we're in a government shutdown, and SNAP benefits for the month of November, the Trump administration has come out and said that they will not be releasing SNAP benefits in the month of November. And so what that means is, because we're in a government shutdown and they're saying this is the start of the fiscal year, and so they're saying, we don't have funding for this. In other government shutdowns, SNAP benefits have always gone out. They have never been withheld. There's different mechanisms that you can use to kind of make up for the loss of appropriations because of the shutdown. There's a kind of like an emergency fund. It's called a contingency fund that exists. The administration has come out and said that they're not going to use that contingency fund, which would cover most of the month of November. And so that's what we're dealing with right now. So it's possible that next month, 42 million people won't get their SNAP benefits. So it's not that they're trying to get rid of SNAP altogether. It's that they cut a significant proportion of funding from SNAP a few months ago. And right now we're kind of up against this government shutdown in this period where there just won't be funding issued for SNAP. And so people won't get their benefits.
Right. And as you stated, SNAP amounts to about 1.5% of annual tax collected. Is that right?
Yeah, it's about $100 billion in a year.
Right. And I think I saw a video that you did online where you sort of pointed out that mega wealthy people in the States would prefer all of us to be fighting over that kind of 1.5% because it acts as somewhat of a distraction to us focusing on other things.
Yeah, do you want me to get into that?
Yeah, unpack that for us here.
Yeah, I think that
Connect the dots.
Yeah, I think that a lot of us are very focused on SNAP and abuse in SNAP. And again, I've already said that less than 1 to 2%. And this is, from a lot of different places, kind of estimating fraud rates. It's consistently estimated at less than 1 to 2% of total SNAP benefits. And so if you think of SNAP, it feeds 1 in 8 people in the country, low income people, $100 billion in a year. So about 1.5% of our tax spend. And people will look at it because there's lots and lots of videos going out and they're really being put out in a very propagandized way, kind of talking about how SNAP itself needs all of this reform and is not a great program. And, if you've never even really thought about SNAP before or don't know this outcome data of how effective and efficient it actually is, you can kind of you'll see like a video of someone abusing the system. And you're like, yeah, that is a terrible program. But I think that it's a big distraction if you're looking at like where our tax dollars are actually wasted, which is what I tried to point out in that video that I did. If you look just at tax evasion by the top 1% of the country, it's over $160 billion in a given year of just the top 1% evading their taxes. That's just illegal tax evasion. They're putting it in offshore accounts or they're, underreporting their income. That's basically they're stealing that money, right? And that's way more than the entire budget of SNAP that feeds 1 in 8 people in the country. So if we're really concerned about, waste in our tax dollars, it would behoove us to look up and look at kind of the waste that's going on at the top and the fraud that's going on at the top versus looking at a very efficient and effective program that feeds people. But we tend to I think that it might be a little bit more difficult to kind of understand kind of all of that at the top and like the military spending waste and the waste at the top and tax evasion versus kind of looking at your neighbor that and being like they're misusing their SNAP benefits or being upset that like, I don't know, someone gets some help buying their groceries, which by the way, average SNAP benefits are $7 a day for a person. So my suggestion would be that we look at kind of the waste and the fraud in other areas, not at the direct programs that directly help the most needy people in this country.
Would you ever consider taking up a role in politics?
Simon, people ask me this all the time, and I don't have strong ambitions to do that. That's not why I talk about this stuff. I mean, I love communicating it. I have 2 little kids at home, and it sounds terrible to have to go back and forth to DC all the time. So, at this stage of my life, no.
Okay, so for now, let's continue to play the hypothetical game. If you were the United States Secretary of Health and Human Services, how high on your priority list would addressing childhood obesity in America be?
Very high.
And how would you...
Probably as high as RFK Jr. talks about it being.
And how would you go about addressing that in terms of the systems you would want to target and the main policy changes?
Yeah, I mean, understanding that, HHS, there's only so much you can do within HHS. So I can talk about all the things that I would do, like if I could wave a magic wand. As the head of HHS, though, the first thing that I would do is I would work with the people in my agencies, particularly the career scientists who have been working on these programs and know a lot about what we could be doing more efficiently, what we could be doing from a policy perspective. What I would not do is kind of act like I know better than all of them and bring in my own people and ignore everything that the career scientists have to say. So that's number one that I think would be a huge difference and help a lot. From there, I would, I think that it's worth looking at our food system. And a lot of this goes with the USDA. So like I would try to work with the USDA because it starts with like our agricultural subsidies, for example, and where we give our money. It starts with some of the programs because we don't have great local food systems in our country. And so if we could enhance our local food systems like they do in European countries, by the way, and those are through programs like grants that help local farmers provide local food to schools and food banks, which we had those grants and they were cut this year. There were some regional business centers that helped farmers, smaller farmers, get some business grants and help them kind of get finances so that they could kind of start their own businesses or grow their businesses. And so I would try to work with USDA on that. Within the FDA, something that I think what is interesting is that a lot of the stuff MAHA talks about, a lot of us in public health also and science also want. So for example, I want more oversight over all of the additives in our food supply. I want to see more post-market analysis over all of the additives. So what that means is once an additive is introduced to the food supply, a post-market analysis would be we go in and assess at routine times those different additives. I want to close the GRAS loophole. So GRAS is generally recognized as safe. It's a loophole where a lot of this stems back to the fact that we haven't had adequate funding at the FDA, particularly in the foods division. And so there hasn't been adequate resources in order to do all of this assessment of all of these additives. And so what I would do is I would try to hire and fund more and ask for more funding for that particular division at the FDA so that we could do things like more of this oversight into some of these additives. But again, that requires funding at the FDA. That requires scientists at the FDA, not cutting. I mean, we're seeing huge cuts, enormous cuts in all of our public health agencies right now.
Is that how it works today, that companies can use novel additives that don't have human safety data in America?
So kind of, but not really. They're supposed to have data. What happened is, I'll kind of give you a background of GRAS. So GRAS is generally recognized as safe. It's a designation at the FDA, and it had good intent back in like the 50s. It was basically, I think it was 58. It was basically any ingredient, when they were looking at what they needed oversight on, it was any ingredient that had been in the food supply that was generally recognized as safe, they gave this designation. So sugar and vinegar and flour and these types of things. So they didn't need to go through robust safety analyses because they were generally recognized as safe. So that was the designation. Now, if a company wanted to use a new ingredient that was generally recognized as safe, for a very long time, that they would just have to go through kind of the FDA process, and it would go through the FDA, and then it would basically approve it or not based on safety data, right? It all had to be submitted to the FDA, and then it was like, okay, this is generally recognized as safe. In the 90s, we went through this very deregulatory era in the 80s and then into the 90s. And the FDA was chronically underfunded, and there was a backlog of not just food additives, because we had this surge in food additives because food science was getting bigger. These corporations wanted to use all these food additives. And so they submitted all of their applications and the safety data, and there was a backlog of the FDA being able to actually have any oversight over that. And that's the same with the pharmaceutical side too, which we kind of overcame with user fees in the early 90s. But the food side had this backlog, and instead of funding the FDA more to get more scientists so that we could kind of decrease that backlog, what they did is they said, okay, what we're going to do is if an ingredient is generally recognized as safe, we're going to tell the corporations that they can go through the same process that we go through at the FDA. They can hire their own scientists, and they can decide if it's generally recognized as safe or not. So it never even had to go through the FDA. And then it was optional. They could submit their findings to the FDA or not. And so what that did is it resulted in lots of food additives that the FDA may not even know is in the food supply, right? They don't have all of the data to see. Now, the idea was that food corporations it's in their best interest to go through, they still have to go through the same process, and they're just doing it on their own. The idea was they're not going to put in an ingredient that doesn't have safety data, because that would be really bad for them, right? That's like the most, what is that thing they say, like the most generous interpretation, right? Now,
assume the best.
Yeah, the alternate to that is that food corporations are looking to go fast, and self-regulation has lots of different problems, right? And so when RFK Jr. talks about closing the GRAS loophole, or anyone talks about it, that's what the loophole is. And so closing that would mean corporations could no longer designate ingredients as generally recognized as safe without going through formal FDA approval. Now, in order to go through that formal FDA approval, you need a strong, robust FDA. I mentioned with the pharmaceutical industry, they overcame that with user fees. So they basically charge pharmaceutical companies a user fee in order to go through these approvals. The foods division doesn't do that. And so instead they have this kind of way to get over the fact that they've been chronically underfunded.
Is that currently something that's being debated? I think I read in the news something about this being controlled at the state level versus the federal level, and some controversy around that.
This is really a federal issue, right? Because if you're thinking of what's going to be in the food supply, corporations are selling federally. So if you have one state who's saying, and we are seeing some of that, like with California and some of these other states, if they're saying, okay, we're not going to include some of these ingredients, is the corporation going to change their formulation for your state alone. If you're California, maybe, because it's such a huge state. If you're a smaller state, likely not. And so it's really something that would have to be done at the federal level.
Yeah, it gets messy pretty quickly, but it does, back to what are food corporations mostly concerned by, which is profits. I can see why people are concerned by self-regulation. You know, if no one's looking, if no one's watching over them, like how incentivized are they to really look deeply into the science that exists on the safety of their ingredients?
This is where the nuance comes in, right? And so, yes, most of us are very for kind of closing this GRAS loophole. What we're not for is overstating what is actually the case. So taking an ingredient and saying it's toxic when there's no evidence that it's actually toxic. And that's really the biggest crux of all of this. It's the problem is if an ingredient is toxic and there's good data that it's like in the dose that we're exposed to, it's a problem. Scientists would be the first, food scientists would be the first to be like, hey, we got to take this out. Like, this is not okay. The problem is when people will kind of use this GRAS loophole as a justification that all of these ingredients are toxic when there's no evidence for that. And, a lot of these, there is evidence on some of these ingredients, and it doesn't say that at all. It actually says that they're quite safe at the dose that we're exposed to. And you can look at the EU as well. And many of these ingredients, they're deemed safe over in the EU. And a lot of people will compare the US to the EU and they'll say, it's banned here and not there. Countries ban different ingredients for varying reasons. For example, we allow some ingredients that the EU bans, like we allow monk fruit extract in our country, whereas they don't allow it in the EU. And a lot of that is not, there's a lot of different reasons. It's not necessarily because there's data to show that monk fruit extract is unsafe in the EU. It's just they regulate a bit differently sometimes.
Yeah, it seems like common sense that if the food scientists and scientists recognize that an ingredient was toxic, they would be shouting about it and proactively pushing for change. But yet there is this kind of story out there that no, there's a coordinated effort almost to suppress information from scientists, perhaps because people, on that side of the fence also say there's ties between industry and science. And then that story kind of weaves into this narrative that RFK Jr. and Trump have on various topics where it's almost as if they have uncovered the science and the finding that has been completely missed by the entire science field.
Yeah, so we see this with autism right now, with, RFK Jr. promising to find the cause of autism by September. And like as if he is going to alone find the cause of something that, hundreds, if not thousands of researchers around the world have been spending their lives dedicated to kind of looking at both genetic and environmental factors of autism. I think I did a video on this when they announced that they were going to find the cause of autism by September, which, again, it's relying on people to not kind of understand how the scientific process works. You can't just define when you're going to find a cause of a very complex neurodevelopmental condition. That's just not something you can do. Yeah, it would. And how great would science be if we could do that, but we can't. And there, as I said, there are scientific researchers who literally dedicate their lives to this question, who are looking at different genetics and identifying genes that are associated with autism and looking at environmental factors and things that could be associated with autism. And for him to kind of swoop in and say, I'm going to alone find the cause of autism and kind of give people false hope, essentially, and pretend that, no one's been asking these questions. And the data that they're using when they say they're doing this, you can't just, first of all, they said that they were going to find a cause by September. I think he came into office, I don't remember which month. Was it February, March? I'm not sure whatever. But within that amount of time, you can't even submit a study and get approval a lot of times through IRB for a multi-center research study in that amount of time, let alone conduct the study, analyze the results, and then write up the paper. And that's just one study. And so what they're doing is they're relying on the data that already exists. And so when he says no one's been asking these questions, questions, he's literally using the data from the scientific researchers who have been asking these questions. So it's just very disingenuous to say. And I think that just kind of speaks to the idea that the whole narrative is about this idea you can't trust scientists. But it's so interesting because he's using the work of scientists, right? Because the scientists have been asking these questions. And, you kind of mentioned funding, and I just want to talk about that a little bit, because the thing about scientific research is it requires funding. I mean, some of these trials are millions and millions of dollars to run these multi-centered randomized controlled trials, and you have to get funding from somewhere. And so I don't know that a lot of people understand these mechanisms, but there's a few different areas, a few different places you can get funding for scientific research. The main source of funding for biomedical research comes from our government. And so that's from the NIH as the main place, but also we have the NSF and a few other places. But mainly the NIH, which is the National Institute of Health, which researchers can write grants to the NIH, and then the NIH chooses kind of the most high impact grants and they get funded. And it's very difficult to get funded through the NIH. I mean, they have a very small percentage of grants that are submitted actually get funding. But that's the main source. A little over 50% of biomedical research gets funded that way. And these percentages will vary depending on the exact kind of specialty we're talking about. But overall, a little over 50%. And then you have industry research. So industry is the other place you can get funding. And that accounts for, about 35-40% of scientific funding. And that comes from different industries. So whether that's the pharmaceutical industry, a biomedical research company, or a biomedical industry company that's funding the research. And then the smallest percentage, 5 to 10% of research funding, comes from things like the American Cancer Society, these nonprofits that are donating. And so when you're thinking of doing some scientific research, if you want less industry funding, because it is, that is a place where people go for scientific research funding, you have to fund the NIH even more. And that's our tax dollars, right? Our tax dollars go to funding NIH research. And so you can't just say that you don't want industry-funded research and then cut 40% of funding from the NIH, which is what Trump asked for in his fiscal year 2026 budget. And so if you're cutting 40% from the NIH, that's going to leave researchers even more reliant on industry funding. And so this is an example of when you don't kind of understand this landscape, people who are kind of upset about industry-funded research, which there's a lot of stopgaps in industry-funded research that we can kind of talk through, but instead of kind of trying to strengthen those stopgaps so that you have less of a conflict there, it's they're trying to say we can't do any industry-funded research, but if you don't want any industry-funded research, you have to fund the NIH so that scientists can do government-funded research. Those are really the only places that you can get funding. Because if you don't get funding there, where are you going to get it? Individual billionaires and what they want to fund, or foreign governments? I mean, those aren't good options.
Right. So if you're pulling funding from the NIH, then presumably for certain topics, what you're doing is increasing the percentage of studies on that topic that are industry funded.
Correct. Yeah, because you would need funding from someone.
Yeah, that makes me think about Kevin Hall, who I have coming on the show in a month or so.
Oh, you do? I'm so glad to hear that. Should we mention why that makes you think of Kevin Hall?
Yeah. I mean, you can probably explain that story better than me. Yeah,
I mean, Kevin if he's coming on your show, he can also explain. But he's a leading nutrition science researcher at the NIH, metabolism researcher, and he was doing some really good work in ultra-processed foods, which the MAHA movement really cares about ultra-processed foods. And so one would think they would love Kevin Hall and the work that he was doing. And he was actually doing work in a metabolic ward, which, a lot of us don't have access to. And it's really amazing to have that in nutrition research, because you can really control for all factors. Because a lot of nutrition science research, we have to kind of abide by kind of natural living constraints, right? People are just out living their lives, and you control for factors as much as you can. But in these metabolic wards, you can really control. And so he was doing research looking at ultra-processed foods and whether or not that if we overeat ultra-processed foods, if that has an impact on our metabolic health when it's matched for macronutrients compared to minimally processed foods, and what's driving us overeating ultra-processed foods. And so he resigned earlier this year from the NIH, kind of citing that his work was being censored, and directly from RFK Jr. And so that is really kind of upsetting to a lot of us in the nutrition science field who really was, I mean, I know I was very excited to see kind of his follow-up study to his first ultra-processed food study.
And just to kind of tie a bow on the Tylenol autism topic, because people might have felt like we opened a can of worms there and didn't completely close your thoughts, I guess, or our thoughts. But I guess the question that I would have, which is somewhat rhetorical for people to consider, is it more likely that scientists have missed this causal evidence linking Tylenol to causing autism? Or is it more likely that RFK Jr., who puts a timeline on finding this cause, has come to conclusions which are at odds with the evidence? And you could sit with that. From your point of view, Jessica, how would you summarize the evidence looking at Tylenol, fever, and autism today as we sit here today? And what future research would you like to see?
Yeah, so I should put a disclaimer that this is not my area of expertise. I'm certainly not a pharmacologist or someone who studies even autism. But what I can tell you just from a purely science perspective, currently as the research stands, and I've learned this from actual researchers in this area who are studying this, there's some correlational data. That correlational data is mixed, and in some of the research that has controlled for familial factors and genetic factors like sibling studies, the correlation goes away. And so even the correlation itself is a bit mixed right now. And so that's why, researchers are continuing to study it, but that's kind of where the evidence lies. There's no causal evidence. And so, generally what happens is if you see an observation and you see two things are correlated, like let's say it's autism and Tylenol, then you would go in and you would design studies to assess causation. And we don't have that evidence to suggest that there's causation. And there's a lot of things that are correlated with autism, because remember, autism rates have increased significantly over the last couple of decades. And most researchers who are in this space will tell you that that is largely because of increased diagnostic criteria and increased screening. And so we've seen kind of these big increases, but that doesn't necessarily mean that many people are getting autism. It means that many more people are getting diagnosed with autism. And so that's a very important distinction. And so we don't actually know the true number of how many more people have autism today than they did a decade or 2 decades ago. We just know how many more people are diagnosed with autism. And so that's where the research stands. And so the problem with coming out and using that mixed correlational data to suggest causation, and the problem with the president saying pregnant women don't take Tylenol, is that Tylenol is the only medication currently recommended in pregnancy for women who have fever, because the other fever reducers actually have worse safety data. So they're not recommended in pregnancy. And so, one of the other things that is strongly correlated with autism is maternal fever. And so if you're telling someone not to take Tylenol if they have a fever, and now they're scared to take Tylenol without any evidence that they should be scared to take Tylenol, you could actually be causing more harm by doing that if they let a fever go unchecked in pregnancy. And so that's, again, an example of kind of if you misdiagnose the problem, your solutions can be harmful.
Changing gears a little bit here, Jessica, as we kind of land the plane. Coming back to the idea of improving scientific literacy at an individual level and all of us becoming more discerning so we can spot certain claims that maybe we want to investigate or think about a little more deeply before we act on them or before we share them as a strong view that we hold ourselves. What do you think would be the kind of top most helpful learnings for the average American that would help them be more discerning when encountering health-related or nutrition-related information?
Yeah, I'll talk about a few of the things that I see a lot that I think that if people kind of knew these things to look for, it could help just identify misleading information online. And so the first, and we've kind of touched on this, but we haven't actually defined what it means, is correlation versus causation. Because what will happen a lot is people will use correlations to imply causation, and you just can't do that. And so a correlation is just two variables that move in at the same time. So whether or not they're inverse or they're at this, it's basically two things that are increasing at the same time are correlated, right, over time. That doesn't necessarily mean that one of those things causes the other. And the best example, most illustrative example of how to explain this would be shark attacks and ice cream sales. So shark attacks and ice cream sales, if you look over a calendar year, they rise and fall together almost perfectly. So as shark attacks go up, ice cream sales go up. As they go down, ice cream sales go down. Now, if you were to take that correlation and suggest that that means that ice cream sales are causing shark attacks, and like try to think up a mechanism. It's because, I don't know, sharks smell the ice cream and come closer to the water, right? And so then that was you implied that, and you said, okay, ice cream sales cause shark attacks, and then you designed a policy to decrease shark attacks, and your policy was to prevent ice cream sales, right? So you couldn't sell ice cream anymore. You're not going to decrease shark attacks, because just because those two things are correlated doesn't mean one causes the other. So the reason that they're correlated, of course, is because of the weather. As it gets warmer, shark attacks increase and ice cream sales increase. And as it gets colder, those both decrease because fewer people are in the water, fewer people are buying ice cream. So that's a correlation. If you wanted to assess causation, you could then go in and design a study like a randomized control trial or another study that could assess causation and look at, control for all of the other variables, right? So in this case, you'd have to control for weather and then see if that still exists. And once you control for weather in that case, you'll see that ice cream sales are not causing shark attacks. And the reason why that's really important is because if you design policies, my shark attack and ice cream example is funny, and that's not necessarily harmful to say, it's harmful to the ice cream companies, I suppose, but it's not necessarily harmful. But you can actually, if you take correlation and then you say that it is causal, you can actually potentially cause harm. I gave the example just now with Tylenol and autism, and potentially, now women won't take it in pregnancy and they'll have a fever, which could be harmful and can cause birth defects and a number of other issues. But there's actually quite a few of these examples over history. Nutritionally, this happened with beta carotene. So in the 70s and 80s, there were some great studies that looked at, a lot of observational studies showed that people who ate more beta carotene had lower incidence of cancer. And what it was hypothesized as was that the beta carotene was in some way protective and protected people from cancer because it acted as an antioxidant. And so supplement companies kind of ran with that. And throughout the 80s and 90s, really, and early 90s, really promoted beta carotene supplements in order to decrease cancer incidence. But then when scientists actually assessed that through a couple of randomized controlled trials in the early 90s that were published in the New England Journal of Medicine, what they found was actually that beta carotene supplementation increased cancer incidence in smokers. And so what they thought was going to decrease cancer rates because they were correlated actually had a very negative impact on smokers. And so the second trial, they had to stop it early because I think it was an almost 30% increase in smokers' cancer rates who were taking beta carotene supplements. So that's an example of, if we have these correlations, we can't just imply causation. You actually have to see if one thing is actually causing the other. So I think that's something to look out for because lots of people do that and they'll say, okay, look at this graph of these two things increasing over time. And they'll do that to kind of scare you about whatever it is. Insert X variable here. So that would be the first one.
A kind of reverse example of that where the association has been confirmed as causal would be cigarettes and lung cancer.
Smoking and lung cancer. And I'm not an epidemiologist, so you should have an epidemiologist on here to explain the Bradford criteria of causation through epidemiology studies. But they essentially were able to control for all of these variables. And so through these kind of epi studies, we'll see that there was a causal link, that smoking was directly causing lung cancer, which is very different than, what I was talking about with the shark attacks or with the beta carotene.
Right, that's just a very unadjusted association without considering all of the other potential variables that could be at play, like you pointed out, weather. What else? Is there anything else on that list of top things that you think would hold people in good stead?
Yeah, I think there's one other big one. So these are just the two that I see a lot. So one is correlation versus causation. Another one is taking a mechanism of action and suggesting that that's going to impact the person in the same way that we see it impact mechanistically. I did a video, I kind of did a parody of it, but it was essentially a woman saying that we shouldn't use sunscreen and instead we should drink watermelon juice because watermelon contains lycopene and lycopene can be converted to act as an SPF for our skin. And that's not necessarily false. Lycopene, if you look at the data, but you'd have to eat an entire watermelon to get something like SPF of 2, right? And if you know anything about SPF, 2 is nothing. 2 is in the oil that I used to use terribly when I was like in high school, laying out in the sun. So, it's not going to be protective of skin cancer, and it should not be used as a substitution for sunscreen. So I did kind of a parody on that to show how people will do this. They'll take a mechanism of action and then extrapolate that to suggest something that just there's no evidence for. And I did it with pickles and showed that pickles have vitamin K in it, which it's true. Pickles do have vitamin K. Vitamin K is needed for the synthesis of osteocalcin, and osteocalcin is needed to make dentin. All of those mechanisms are true. And dentin is required in teeth to protect them from cavities. So it's shown that like mouths with more dentin or teeth with more dentin have fewer cavities. Again, all of those things are true. What's not true is that if you eat pickles, you don't need to brush your teeth because it's protective of cavities. And so just recognizing that people will do this and they'll take kind of a mechanism, but human bodies are complex. And so just because you see something in a petri dish in the lab, or even just in a lab experiment, in an animal experiment, once you assess that in a human model, oftentimes, almost all the time, you don't see that same outcome in a human model. And so just looking out for those two things, I think is really helpful.
Yeah, what's difficult there is, and you pointed this out, there often is a sliver of truth to what they're saying, which makes it compelling. And, I often, which is kind of similar to what you were just describing there, where people will zoom in on a mechanism and kind of conflate the acute sort of outcome that you see, like eating a food and blood sugar goes up a little bit. And yes, we know that very high blood sugar, very high, particularly like 2 hours post-meal, is associated with all sorts of downstream health consequences. But people get confused and equate the acute kind of immediate response to a food as the chronic effect of that. And a basic example of that is like when we go and exercise, our heart rate and blood pressure goes up.
And oxidative stress increases.
Right. If you just looked at those things without knowing that this person was exercising, you might say, well, exercise is harmful. Whatever you're doing, whatever behavior it is, stop it. But we know from long-term outcome data that it's actually healthy. So to close this out, I have one more question or thought I'd like to get from you. A lot of what we have discussed today kind of centers on power, who controls the narrative, who profits from confusion, and then ultimately who pays the price, like the American public. If you could give one message to RFK Jr., to Casey Means, to Kelly Means, or anyone really that's leading MAHA, what would you say to them?
I think I would say there are a lot of people in this space that have been doing this work for a very long time who care about the things that you're talking about and that you seem to care about as well. And you should work with them. And we could all be stronger together if we relied on kind of the evidence base that exists and put forth real meaningful change that could actually decrease chronic disease rates and actually improve the health of Americans. And it doesn't have to be at odds with the scientific and public health communities. It can be in concert with them.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Jessica. Appreciate your time today. And I've learned a lot. I loved our time together. I'd love to have you back on the show. Appreciate all of your hard work. And I'm sure all of the listeners and people across America and across the globe are really, really grateful for everything that you do. So please don't stop.
Thanks so much for having me, Simon.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.